Welcome back, Pontiac High School students. Today's lesson is on a foreign policy overview. It's part one of really a three-part series in how America has navigated foreign policy throughout its history. This part one, is going to be looking at independence through World War I, really looking at a time of American-French alliance and a time of mostly isolationism. So let's take a look at how we got there. Independence and the early years. Following the Revolution, George Washington, was concerned about America being involved in European affairs. He was particularly worried about this because he thought that foreign powers would be more powerful and therefore could take advantage of Americans in any foreign relations. Washington, and later Jefferson as well, advised the nation to be free from foreign entanglement. They didn't want treaties. They didn't want us going to war. They wanted us to ignore Europe as much as we possibly could, except for necessary trade. This became a policy known as isolationism. American isolationism quickly came to mean non-involvement in Europe. It did not, however, mean that we were going to stay out of all Western Hemisphere affairs. That is, were involved very much with Native American communities in particular, and this related mostly to American westward expansion. So we were very much involved in non-European affairs. Now, expansion in the Western Hemisphere was a big trend in American history for our first 100 years. Within the Western Hemisphere, the United States was very involved, and we wanted to look at both our colonial neighbors and our native neighbors. And looking to the future, the U.S. recognized very early on that it could be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. We had a reasonably strong economy, especially after we'd gotten out of those early war, or the years right after the Revolutionary War. Our economy stabilized and started to grow. And there wasn't developed industrial civilizations around us, which gave us a strong military and economic advantage over the natives of the continent. So we could become a very powerful nation. We also looked for further opportunities to solidify our role in the Western Hemisphere. This came when the Napoleonic Wars, these happened right around 1800, created a major distraction in Europe. And many Latin American countries started to fight successfully for their own independence. See, Latin American countries were governed mostly by Spain. And Spain had a very heavy hand there, and Latin American nations didn't like the Spanish very much, but the Spanish were powerful and strong and maintained control. But when France and Spain go to war in Europe and they're fighting against each other, Spanish power is really weakened. And they have to pull all their military out of Latin America, which leads to successful revolution. Now, following the Napoleonic Wars, Spain wants to reconquer all of its lost territory. But the United States and England discouraged any recolonization of the hemisphere. They really had taken advantage of this moment to establish trading relationships with Spain's former colonies, and they didn't want to lose those. So let's pull up this quick map and show you. This is just a picture that demonstrates the Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe made a statement that basically said, Western Hemisphere is off limits to future European colonization. So all of you guys got to stay over there. You can party it on up in Europe, and you can play with your colonies in Africa and Asia, but the Western Hemisphere is off limits. The United States is going to protect that. Now, we weren't really strong enough to do that on our own, but with Britain backing us up in that policy, there was no significant efforts to recolonize the Western Hemisphere. All right. So the United States is going to get a little bit more aggressive when we look at the Mexican-American War. Sorry, my computer is being a little twitchy right now. All right. In the 1840s, Texas wins independence from Mexico, and it becomes annexed by the United States. So Mexico had become an independent country in the 1810s, and Texas later decides that they don't want to be a part of Mexico. So they fight a brief war and separate from Mexico and become the independent Republic of Texas. But later, not too much time passes, they apply for statehood with the United States, and they get admitted to the United States, or annexed and become a state within the U.S. This, however, is one aspect that helps provoke a war between the U.S. and Mexico. The war was over specifically where the southern border of Texas was. Was it along the Rio Grande, or was it along this other river that I don't remember the name of? The U.S. does win this war, and in addition to taking Texas, they take over lots of other territories as well from Mexico. A few years later, we're going to expand further and take over Alaska by buying it, and take over Hawaii by overthrowing their queen, kicking her out. But let's take one quick look at this map. All right, so American expansion 1803 to 1853. Here we had the United States right after the Revolution. So east of the Mississippi River. Then in 1803, we purchased Louisiana, we bought all of this land, and we expanded further west. We took Florida from Spain in 1819. I say took. It was given to us, but it was given to us under threat. Then we annexed Texas in 1845. This was part of a conflict between Texas and Mexico, and we got Texas as a result of that. And when we beat up Mexico in the war that followed, we forced Mexico to give up California, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and parts of New Mexico and Colorado as well. So we took over that big area from Mexico. We did pay for it, but we paid like pennies for it. We later then do buy this stretch of land right here, the Gadsden Purchase, which made it easier to send railroads between Texas and California. And we bought, as I mentioned before, we bought Alaska, and we kicked the Queen of Hawaii out. So we really did expand quite a bit. Ooh. Looks like I don't have my slide covers for these ones. All right, so geez, it is very slow right now. I apologize, this is a very slow reaction on my computer's part, so it's overreacting to every move I make, which is making it difficult. All right, a world power. So after the United States defeats Mexico and has further negotiations with Britain and Russia and settles some other territorial issues, the U.S. is really just recognized as a regional power. There is no doubt the United States in 1850 is the biggest power in the Western Hemisphere. We are a regional power. And we can't yet compare with Britain, France, and a few other players in European strength, but we are now feeling confident that we could pick a few fights and maybe even do well. We can throw our weight around a little bit. This becomes very clear to everybody in the Spanish-American War. This was our first test as a major world power since 1812. 1812, we'd fought a war against Great Britain that nobody really won, but Britain wasn't really throwing their heart into it. But in 1898, we fight this war against Spain. The U.S. had fought for Cuban independence. We wanted Cuba to be an independent nation. And in exchange, Cuba had promised to give us favorable trade rights on the island. It will later cause some conflict between us and Cuba that really hasn't yet been settled. But that was what we got in exchange. And we saw Spain as being weak. And we thought that, hey, we might be able to take on this former global power. Spain was at one point the most powerful nation in the world. That had been a long time before this. But we put ourselves up against them. And in 4 months, we whooped them. Spain did very poorly in this war. As a result, the United States gained Puerto Rico. We also gained Guam and the Philippines as territories. And Cuba became an independent nation. This helps to trigger something called the good neighbor policy. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. uses its influence to really control our Latin American neighbors. We weren't all that nice to them in our good neighbor policy. President Roosevelt ensured Latin American countries would be open to American business. Okay, you have to accept American businesses. You can't close your markets to us. And if you did, we would support a revolution. We would overthrow your leadership. And under this good neighbor policy, we really did invade a number of Latin American countries to replace their government and force American businesses upon them. Out in China, in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. had gained control of the Philippine Islands, which are off the Chinese coast. And we hoped to use this as a springboard to China. See, other nations had kind of carved up China at this time. China was fairly weak. And they had restricted trade. They created colonies where there was a British section where only the British could trade. There was a German section where only the Germans could trade. The United States basically said, no, we want to be able to trade wherever we want. And we forced others to allow this U.S. trade through forcing an open door policy. And we did this basically by sending big ships over there and bullying people around and really testing to see what we could do. We were able to force China open to trade from the United States. So by the start of World War I, the United States has now been throwing its weight around for about 20 years and is doing pretty well, feeling pretty good. We are a major world power by the start of World War I. And out of World War I, we become even more powerful. This happens because World War I beats up Europe. Europe is destroyed in this war. But the U.S. didn't enter the war until late, so it didn't cost us much. And none of the fighting in World War I was in the United States, so we weren't damaged. So we hadn't spent much. We were undamaged, and we were the victors of the war. And winning this war really helped Americans establish trading relationships in Europe and see the advantages of getting involved over there. However, it does have a flip side. Following World War I, the Republican Party really comes out and says, you know, this was a mistake. America should really only worry about its own business. We became a world power while we were only focused on our own issues. World War I was an example of something we should not get involved in. Kind of the we got lucky, but let's not do this again approach. Many believe that the recent engagements with Spain and Germany had taken our nation's focus off of business, and that the business of America was business, and that they wanted us to get back to that. So the U.S. did return to this kind of isolationist policy after World War I, and we'll see that the rest of the world kind of suffers from this because they had been beat up in the war. They needed leadership. They needed somebody strong to kind of guide them through those post-war years, and the U.S. refused to be that nation. So we get the rise of dictatorships and some bad guys. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin all come up during this period. We'll get to know them all next time. We've had a long lesson. Let's wrap this up. I'll see you next time. Farewell.